school isn't a place you have to be, why not go to school where remote learning can be as remote as you want?
Welcome to our webinar space. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights video that we just saw was created by Seth Braw and Amy Poncher at the Human Rights Action Center in 2007-8. The music is by Rumspringa, courtesy of Cantora Records. This video is actually part of an ongoing campaign to print the Universal Declaration of Human Rights into passports. Fewer than 5% of the world knows that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights even exists. The Human Rights Action Center asks governments to acknowledge the Declaration's existence and pronounce their commitment to uphold these basic human rights by including the Declaration in all passports. We are located on the traditional territory of the Wendat, Petun Nation, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This land has been the site of human activity for over 15,000 years and is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, a sacred treaty between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabeg. The people online with us are from all across Turtle Island, and we acknowledge and respect the people of this land. My name is Nancy Russell, and I'm the program coordinator of the Criminal Justice Program at Canadian Friends Service Committee, or CFSC for short. For those of you who were here last week, some of this may be a bit repetitive. CFSC, founded in 1931, acts on the peace and social justice concerns of Quakers in Canada. We seek to alleviate suffering and work to develop transformative and sustainable approaches to human rights, justice, and peace. We act through practical assistance, research, education, and policy dialogues. CFSC is a federally registered charity since 1967 and a not-for-profit corporation. As we said last week, Canadian Quakers believe in penal abolition, and that means in part that justice must be compassionate and focus on how to heal rather than how to punish. In 1981, Canadian Quakers became the first religious body to call for the abolition of prison. Quakers in Canada are also involved in prison visitation, restorative justice, rehabilitation, and coalitions working toward penal reform, as well as the Alternatives to Violence Project, or AVP. An example of this program can be found at the New Brunswick Monthly Meeting AVP. AVP first arose in 1975 when the Quaker Project on Community Conflict assisted inmates at Greenhaven State Prison in New York to run a workshop. Many of the current facilitators in the Maritimes are members or attenders of Quaker meetings in New Brunswick and in Nova Scotia. AVP Atlantic focuses its efforts on the Dorchester institution. There's also a CFSC produced document displayed on our website called Alternatives to Prison: What Would a World Without Prisons Look Like? It presents a menu of viable options like community-based sentences, restorative justice, and healing lodges, to name a few. We would be happy to send you the PDF document if you're interested. Just let us know after the presentation tonight. So tonight is the second of a series of 3 webinars that are part of phase 2 of The Only Way Forward, an initiative of CFSC. Phase 1 of the project began in mid-September and consisted of a 30-day do the work calendar and companion Facebook page. The calendar phase of the project blended opportunities for exploration and self-reflection with online discussions, feedback, and the occasional Zoom film screening. The focus was on the justice system, colonialism, systemic racism, its impacts, alternatives, and next steps. We have also been working with an advisory group of consultants since the early summer, and they have been instrumental in guiding the Only Way Forward project. One of our speakers here tonight is a member of the advisory group. You'll find out soon enough who that is. Before I introduce our esteemed speakers, I'd like to share a few pieces of research-based data from Statistics Canada, beautifully denoted actually by Ryerson University's Dr. Singh and MA student Emily Van Howert in a series of infographics on crime, myths, and facts. And we can send you the link if you're interested. It's quite impressive. But here are the facts, not fake news, evidence-based data, evidence-based numbers from Statistics Canada. So crime rates in Canada have consistently been falling since 1998. Often calls for service received by the police have nothing to do with crime. In fact, 50 to 80% of all calls police respond to are about non-criminal matters: alarms, disturbances, disputes, traffic accidents, sick or injured persons, overdoses, wellness checks, and quarreling neighbors. And that's from Police Resources Canada 2018. Maintaining a convicted person in the community costs 74% less than maintaining that person in a prison in Canada. In 2017-2018, the average yearly cost of locking up one person in federal prison in this country was $120,571, which is equivalent to either annual tuition for 17 students at Ryerson University, or the cost of 6 infants in full-time childcare for 1 full year in Toronto, or social housing for approximately 16 households in Ontario for 1 year. So I hope these stats have stimulated your appetite for hearing about alternatives to the current criminal justice system in Canada. I'd like to introduce our guest speakers now. We are lucky and pleased to have Judy Cameron with us tonight. If you want to wave to the crowd, Judy, that would be great. Judy is a mental health counselor and a member of Fort Albany First Nation. She currently lives in Thunder Bay, Ontario. Judy is a mother of 2 and a grandmother of 4. With over 35 years of experience working with individuals and families in a variety of settings throughout Northern Ontario, Judy has stories to tell. She was also a part-time instructor at Confederation College, teaching classes in the Native Child and Family Worker and the Community Aboriginal Advocacy programs. Most of Judy's work has been with Indigenous children, families, and communities. Despite retiring in 2011, Judy is presently working as a mental health counselor in Wapakika First Nation. Judy's also a member of the Only Way Forward advisory group and has been working with us since early summer. Tim Black, if you want to give a wave, Tim, is the Director of Consulting at the Whiteboard Clinic in Eugene, Oregon. Fun fact from Wikipedia that I found out this afternoon about Eugene: several spots within this city are believed to be inspiration for locations in the Simpsons TV show. Tim, feel free to elaborate or dispute that. With a background in runaway and homeless youth, harm reduction, and street outreach, Tim began working for Cahoots as a crisis intervention worker in 2010 before moving into an administrative role as the Cahoots operations coordinator. Tim's work with Whiteboard and Cahoots has put him in touch with cities across North America looking to implement services based on the Cahoots model of behavioral health first response. Programs based on the Cahoots model have been developed in Olympia, Washington, and Denver, Colorado, and I think other cities by now too, but I don't have the list. Tim can tell us about that. In addition to Tim's work with the Whiteboard Clinic, he also serves as the Vice President of the Board of Directors for Eugene's Community Supported Shelters. I first heard about the Cahoots program during an NPR radio interview in June of this year, and we are thrilled to have Tim with us tonight. Our first speaker tonight is Rick Kelly. Rick is the founder of Just Us, a center for restorative practices. Now, I have known about Rick Kelly and heard his name all over the child and youth care field for years and years. Almost all of my colleagues and friends knew him. They were Facebook friends with him. Some taught with him at George Brown College. Some had worked with him, taken his courses, but we had never met until his Center for Restorative Practices finally sent me an invite to join their Facebook group. So now we know each other, and my first move was to put Rick to work on this webinar. Rick was first introduced to the restorative model through an Indigenous lens. He has been trained by a Buddhist, a rogue teacher, police officer, a pastor from youth detention, and Kay Pranis, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, at the Canadian School of Peace Building. Rick has a master's in restorative practices, a BA in philosophy, which he was told would doom him to a short and dead-end career. Obviously, that wasn't true. Rick strives to unlock from the legacy of the predominant justice system in order to build ecosystems that are just and equitable. And we're delighted to welcome Rick Kelly to The Only Way Forward tonight.
Very good. Okay, so I'm going to go back and forth between a slideshow and a short video clip. I'm talking about building anti-oppressive ecosystems and community using next generation restorative practices. The way I think about that is to frame the conversation as 2 questions. So one question is, how do we get from harm, hurt, pain, trauma to another place? And so our starting point is harm and hurt. The other question is, actually, could we start in a very different place before there is harms, hurts, pain, and trauma, and build something radically different? So that's the challenge. And probably what I'll do while talking about both is more emphasize the latter, which is how can we build communities, systems, education, agencies that are embracing restorative communities that are strong and resilient. so the way I'm going to do this is to give one story and give two interconnected examples. The one story is actually my partner, who I've worked with since 2012, Simone Walters. She came into the Child and Youth Work program in 2012 as a mature student. I met her there. She did advanced training in restorative practices. And then our lives, our professional lives, continued to intertwine in the program there and through a number of initiatives that are still continuing to this date. So it's been an incredible 8-year journey. So we typically present together, but we can't always do that. So in order to be able to make her voice available, what we have done is create a documentary that chronicles different aspects of our work together and separately. So what I'm doing is going to put on a little clip from this documentary we created. She's talking about the end of her first year and when tragedy descended for her. So let me switch my screen again.
In August of that year, as I was preparing myself to enter into my second year of college, my youngest son, Taj, was shot and killed on the community plaza across from the street from where we lived. He was 15 years old. 2 weeks after his passing, on the day of his viewing, there were 2 other young children who were also shot and killed. They were preparing themselves to attend his viewing when their life was taken. Shortly after their passing, I was approached by my children's grandfather, who worked with Unifor at the time. And he had said that the union wanted to do something to support the families. So we formed a group that consisted of my children's former high school principal, a few community leaders, the community pastor and mentor, leaders of the union, other family members, and one of the mothers who had lost her son a few months before mine. We held a fundraiser in memory of Taj and spoke at the union's annual meeting, where I was able to share my story with others about the tragedy that the community was going through. Between both events, we raised over $10,000 towards a contribution in giving back to our community of Jane and Finch. With that, we created a mural in honor of 12 youth who had died within 10 years of that time, all due to gun violence. It was amazing to honor their lives in such a way, and we were proud to be able to contribute to their families in a way that brought some closure. But it still didn't seem enough. When my son was killed, I heard that the person who had killed him was also a young person, and immediately my heart went out to him. I wanted to figure out why. I wanted to understand what he was going through as a young person. I wanted to hear about what led him to take the life of another young person, and what I could have done to be able to support him in making sure that he reached his greatest potential. Because my son was no longer around for me to be able to do that. From that came a dream to build a community center in the community in honor of my son, and I shared it with the group as a dream. We had come up with a name that was fitting for this center, called Towards a Higher Journey, named after my son. I wanted to address the issues that youth were facing. I wanted to address the challenges that they were facing. I wanted to give them a place of hopes and dreams. I wanted a space that didn't seem like what they were surrounded by, but a space that they would come together and create families, create restoration, feel oriented as a community, and thrive. But at the time, it was just a dream.
You can stop there now, Kira. And then if you can give me back my screen.
Should be good to go.
Okay, so do I have speaker? Okay, so can I want to share. Okay, good. Okay. Okay, someone noted in the chat, just listening to that gives one chills. And I think any of us who would have been faced with what Simone was faced with may not be able to recover, to even think of what she was able to think of. So let's hold that for a moment and just step back for a second. So part of my thinking around the restorative approach that I take is to build from different sources that I think are incredibly important to help us, look at things differently. Most importantly, our Indigenous and Afrocentric ways of thinking. There's faith-based models, the abolitionist model, and we can look to natural models as well. I think what it comes from the Indigenous and Afrocentric point of view, and Fania Davis has written about that, are a number of things. So in the Lakota language, the translation is that we are all related. In the Cree Emishif language, it talks about how we are all connected as individuals, as species within this earth, and that we all have a responsibility to take care of what's been given to us as gifts. From an Afrocentric point of view, many people have heard the word Ubuntu, and what that means is I am because of you. And if we relate it to Simone's experience, your pain is my pain, and your salvation is my salvation. So those different perspectives, really bring home the point that we are really interconnected, and that our well-being very much hinges on the well-being of each other, and that we need each other to be able to create great communities and ones that are resilient and that lift us up. Tim Chapman, who works in Ireland for the last 30 years on restorative practices, suggests that we need to move from an ecosystem to an ecosystem. One where people work cooperatively, where there's high levels of diversity, where there's less disconnection, where there are bridges, not walls, and where we take the time to invest in restoring and building relationships, which actually do take time. So when I look at it, back to the question that I framed, for me, restorative practices can be put into two baskets. One is what's often called restorative justice, and that's working in the harm space. And the harm space is when people have done things to other people or they've experienced harms, and we begin our work there. But the equity space, the socially just space, is more a primary focus where we spend our time building communities, building relationships, and creating a context for when there are harms, we're much more connected in a way that allows us to address those issues and to be able to find ways through that. So I think there needs to be, and I work from a point of view of a continuum, that even if there are harms and that's where we start, how do we start moving it back to a place where we're starting to build community so we've got foundations to build from? So 2 examples illustrate that. So for a number of years, I worked in the Social Innovation Hub at George Brown College. What the Social Innovation Hub was an alternative field placement internships that allowed community service workers to students to come in with an idea, a passion, oftentimes their pain, because many of the students at the college mirrored the communities that they were working in and where they'd come from, where they've been marginalized and excluded. So it was an opportunity to build using their voices, their experiences, and then by providing them with the tools to be able to design products, initiatives, and in some cases, social enterprises. So Simone came into the Innovation Hub, and she came in with that idea, which was, I want to build a community center that's based on peacemaking principles. That's a safe space, an equitable space, and a space where hopes that typically were deferred for individuals in that particular community, the Jane Finch community, would have a place to actually come alive. When she brought that to me, I said, that's powerful. My guess is it will take 5 to 10 years, and we've got 8 months to work on that. Our goal wasn't always to complete a project. It was more to begin the different stages of design and iteration. So we began the process. So naturally, we weren't able to get anywhere near, building a community center, but she'd been inspired by the responses from funders, from partners, United Way, the local community that said, yes, this is an incredibly good idea. So she moved on from the college, got her first job working with Osgoode Hall, the law department, as an outreach worker into Jane Finch, and then moved from there to Toronto Community Benefits. And there, Toronto Community Benefits is charged with and mandated to secure community benefits for any infrastructure builds throughout the city of Toronto. And those community benefits are the nature of jobs. So in this case, they were looking at the building of the Eglinton Crosstown through Metrolinx. And the requirement, the agreement was 10% of 3,000 jobs would be sort of dedicated to the 4 equity groups that Toronto Community Benefit Networks worked with. And then sort of complementing that in the process, since they were building in the Jane Finch community through negotiation, they agreed to dedicate 32 meters of frontage, which could be used for a community center. And that has moved on, and the picture that I just showed you was an architectural design. And if anybody followed the headlines around this, Metrolinx in the summer reneged on the province, or the promise. There was a huge outcry, and then they actually came back to the table, took back their renege, put in writing that they would follow through with this, and now it's a green light. But when you work from a restorative building point of view, there's many ripple effects to what you're doing. So one of the things that was happening in 2017 was that the Liberal government, the provincial government, had set up an envelope for Black youth action projects. I looked at that and I saw that there was a real potential for a transformational model. I approached Simone, Rosemary Powell, who was the director. We drew in 2 other agencies, Drive Your Life with Shola and Farley Flex and Roderick Barrington, and decided to come together. And what I did was I wrote a program model that was based on a transformational process that would involve mentoring Black youth and create pathways for Black youth into the trades. And how that would happen is that seasoned journeymen would become their mentors and then help them with the process of not only developing job skills, but at the same time dealing with the anti-Black racism that was graphically and sometimes not so graphically illustrated on the job. And these journeymen were seasoned individuals who had dealt with this, along their work life and even before that. And for anybody who wonders about, the graphic example, all you need to do is Google the headlines through late spring and into September, when there was this total of 7 nooses found on work sites around the city. From a labor market point of view, Black persons occupy 1.2% of the trades in the construction industry, which anybody could see is woefully inadequate in terms of representation. The elements of the model that were restorative were that we developed, relational engagement processes starting from day one, from the point of contact with mentees and mentors, that we used restorative inquiry for the interviews, open-ended questions, and used the peacemaking circle model to deliver the curriculum, which was 10 different modules, some for the mentees and some for the mentors, dealing with job-related issues, but also how to deal with racism on the job. The other aspect of the circle process and larger circles was to actually build community amongst the mentees and the mentors. What the mentors said from their point of view in terms of experience was that this was the first time that they'd ever been convened as a group, acknowledged for their skills and ability, and been able to give back to the community. They felt that it was a real opportunity to not only to give now, but also to give for the future. What the mentees said, what the females said was that this was a great opportunity because one, they were acknowledged. Simone was the project leader, and as one of the women said, and you said, and Black women, a first in her life. They were able to step out of their shells and created their own independent circle group. For the young men, what they said was Simone was like a mother to her. They could go to her regardless. She was a guide, and for once in their life, they had goals. So that clearly indicated how powerful it was. At this point in time, 3 years later, there's 165 mentees and 25 mentors. The project will continue post-funding because Toronto Community Benefit Network sees this as a backbone of their program, and now they've extended it to their other equity groups. So if I were to wrap up what I'm talking about, 2 points. As Paulo Freire wrote, if the structure does not permit dialogue or opportunity, the structure must be trained. That must be changed. And from a restorative point of view, what I would say is that there are a number of elements that are critical here. One, the focus is on repairing the future, not just the past. It hinges on building relationships and community. It's about confronting legacies, both structural, systemic, and generational. It builds on the voices of those who experienced those legacies of discrimination and marginalization. It has high expectations, works from a perspective of hope and opportunity, and eventually, or ultimately, it's about investing and taking the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. That's given me a lot to think about. And I know I have questions, and probably other people do, that we will ask you at the end. Tim, you're up.
Thank you. So I wanted to take a moment to just kind of talk about what we're doing here in Oregon, in the U.S., to really address, a really crucial intersection of, behavioral health response and law enforcement. The CAHOOTS program, which is an acronym, CAHOOTS stands for Crisis Assistance, Helping Out on the Streets, is just one program of Whiteboard Clinic. Whiteboard Clinic has been serving the community of Eugene and Springfield here in Oregon since 1970, and the CAHOOTS program has been a formal response since 1989. To really understand where CAHOOTS comes from, we really need to first talk about where Whiteboard Clinic got its start. Whiteboard Clinic today is a federally qualified health center. We have a dozen programs that span services ranging from behavioral health on an outpatient basis, including addiction services. We have a medical and dental program that provide services at low or no cost to members of our community. We have peer support and systems navigation, and we have a pretty robust 24/7 crisis response, both in the form of a traditional walk-in center and phone line, and with the CAHOOTS mobile crisis program. Regardless of what service it is specifically at Whiteboard Clinic somebody is accessing, all of our services are going to be oriented around, around being patient-centered, employing a harm reduction model, and being trauma-informed. We also operate as an entire organization as a consensus-based collective, which really means that we strive to break down those traditional power systems, those hierarchies, and really, elevate all of the voices of those that participate in really providing services to our community, to make sure that those things that we talk about practicing with, our patients, with our neighbors out in the community, we are applying day in and day out to our interactions with each other as colleagues in this mission to serve our community. Specifically around, kind of the response to crisis in our community, the founders of Whiteboard Clinic were really, in the late 60s, recognizing both the impact of deinstitutionalization practices by the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, but also a recognition of how the existing systems in our community were really falling short when it came to responding to the increased need that came with kind of the counterculture movement. Being a liberal college town on the West Coast, straight shot up the highway from the Bay Area up into Victoria, we were seeing a really I think disproportionate impact that had to do with that influx of mental health issues and addiction that were really coming into our community, and we were seeing our founders were seeing a lot of young people who may be ending up in the hospital because they were experiencing a really acute psychedelic experience that wasn't going well for them, and seeing these folks almost in worse shape after they got out of the hospital than when they had gone in. Going into the hospital, having that experience, and then being loaded up with Thorazine, and then being booted out of the hospital after you wake up, now still experiencing some of the emotional impacts of your experience, but on top of that, tremors, spasms, there was just really a recognition that the systems in place at that time weren't working at all. Our founders looked to see what was working throughout the country, and found two really great examples, one down in San Francisco with the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, but then also closer to us, our neighbors to the north in Portland, with Outside In. And it was really the inspiration between the things that are happening in Portland and down in San Francisco that gave us the framework for what became the Whiteboard Socio-Medical Aid Station. As soon as we started to offer services to the Eugene and Springfield community, as soon as we opened up our crisis line, we started to hear about these situations going on. We were learning from community members about crises unfolding in the community where somebody wasn't able to make it to that payphone, flip through the yellow pages, and then call Whiteboard Clinic, or what somebody was experiencing was really presenting a lot of barriers to them coming and accessing our clinic. So there was this need for a community-based resource. Kind of recognizing some of the vernacular of the time, if somebody was in such a profound crisis that they couldn't utilize the phone, or coming to us wasn't going to work out, that was called a bummer, right? So somebody's having a bummer of enough of an experience that they need that support in the form of community-based crisis response. And so Whiteboard Clinic activated what we called the Bummer Squad. This was a group of volunteers using personal vehicles, a brown bag full of some first aid supplies, and we were just going out in the community trying to do whatever we could to really just really meet people where they're at, literally and metaphorically, to try and have some different outcomes for them. At the same time that we were really kind of beefing up what this Bummer Squad response looked like, toying with an integrated healthcare approach of pairing an EMT when we could, or a nurse or a doctor alongside that crisis worker, Whiteboard Clinic was really establishing itself as a destination for public safety to bring folks, instead of taking them to the hospital where they were just going to get sedated, that we were able to really present a pretty big opportunity for law enforcement to partner with an organization to divert folks from both the ER and from future criminal legal involvement. So for about 20 years, we really kind of tinkered on one hand with what would it look like for us to be responding in the community, while also really demonstrating to public safety that we had a role to play. They might not always like how Cahoots, or how Whiteboard Clinic staff presented. You read some news articles from early on in our tenure in the community, and you hear where it's hard to tell the difference between providers and the patients in the community that we were serving, and that was intentional. Really, it was a recognition that there is so much inherent power that comes from service delivery, and that if we can break down some of those power dynamics by just removing those visual cues that we are in a position of authority, we can have some really tremendously powerful outcomes. So that trusting relationship with the community, with public safety, was building, and an opportunity came along in '89 for us to partner with the city of Eugene and the Eugene Police Department in a more direct way. By employing funds through a community policing grant, we were able to actually formalize the Cahoots response. The Cahoots program from its inception has always been structured within the public safety system. We are third-party contractors coming in as vendors to work with the existing infrastructure to provide behavioral health first response. Today, Cahoots is providing 60 service hours per day to our entire community of 235,000 folks in the metro area, which is a far cry from where we were when we started at just 40 hours a week, not even working around the clock or providing services 7 days a week. Anytime that you see the Cahoots response teams out in the field in Eugene and Springfield here, you're going to notice that it's a two-person team. Anytime that Cahoots response teams are out there, that two-person team is going to be made up of somebody who's an EMT, at least a basic, if not higher, and then a crisis intervention worker. Our crisis intervention workers don't need to be a master's level clinicians. We're not looking for a bunch of alphabet soup and credentials behind your name. And we definitely prioritize lived experience. Regardless of what background you come to us with, we got to train you into Cahoots, right? Kind of get you used to how Cahoots approaches our service delivery. And so all new staff go through an average of 500 hours of field training and 30 hours of time in the classroom. You compare that to a CIT program for officers in a community where they are at best getting 40 hours of training, while really kind of being indoctrinated into a system that is always oriented around force and an adversarial relationship with those in the community. Cahoots teams are always unarmed, and we rely on verbal de-escalation, and we emphasize support and stabilization in the field, really trying to push for least intervention necessary. For those 60 service hours per day that it takes to really kind of cover our metro area, and that's with 2 vans overnight and 3 vans during the day, the total cost of operations for our program hovers right around 2.3, 2.4 million. And all of that funding comes to us through either the city, state grant, or funding from our Medicaid providers. So that's kind of some federal health insurance coverage as well. Cahoots teams respond to a wide variety of situations that are informed by mental health, addiction, poverty, and homelessness. Kind of the primary areas where we see the majority of our calls are for wellness checks, especially for folks who are just out in the community, really only guilty of sitting or sleeping while poor or unhoused. We respond for suicidal ideation calls, other issues related to, like I said, mental health and addiction, but we also are able to do a lot of prevention in the form of mediation, responding for harm reduction, being able to facilitate first aid and non-emergency medical care, facilitating resource referrals and connections, and transportation and other services. There's also just a wide variety of other things that we do that don't fit neatly into some little bucket or fall neatly under some umbrella. And that's where Cahoots teams really speak to the need for there to be really versatile responses within public safety, and that as we re-envision what public safety looks like in the 21st century, that what we're trying to address in large part has nothing to do with criminality, and that these are issues that largely stem from public health, and that we need to take a public health perspective as we evaluate whether or not responses that exist in our community are effective today. All calls for service for Cahoots come through the public safety dispatch. There's not some secret backdoor number that you can call to get Cahoots to come out to talk to you. We have to run everything through our dispatch center. That allows us to really triage those calls and make ourselves accessible to folks that might not know about Cahoots, or who perceive what they're experiencing to be so emergent that 911 and emergency services are the only resource that they think is going to really adequately address what they have going on for them. So all our calls for service come through the public safety answering point. They're triaged by the same call takers that are coaching you through CPR, or determining whether they need to send police or a fire department out to you to a situation out in the community. After those calls have been triaged and it's determined that Cahoots is the appropriate resource to send, our teams go out in the field, being dispatched over the same channels as law enforcement patrol. That means that in those rare circumstances, less than once a day on average, where our teams are encountering really escalated situations, that law enforcement knows where we are and they can come and support us right away. But also, like I said, just really allows us to, really have a lot of touch points within that public safety ecosystem, and really achieve high levels of diversion from criminal, legal, or emergency medicine involvement. Let's kind of take a moment to quantify these different responses. And so just zooming in on Eugene, not our entire metro area, but just the city of Eugene. Last year, there were 105,000 calls that came through the public safety dispatch system. Of those 105,000 calls that came in from the public, Cahoots responded to around 18,000 of those calls. We handled 15,000 of those responses without other infrastructure, and of those calls, 13,000 of them would have required police, fire, or ambulance to show up and respond if Cahoots teams hadn't been available. It's estimated that we divert 5 to 8% of our patients from further criminal legal involvement, especially arrest. And it's really important to highlight that through all of that work, through those thousands of calls that Cahoots teams responded to last year, that in Eugene, we only needed to call for police cover 311 times. That's less than once a day. And that 311 cover calls is a pretty even split between situations where there was violence or aggression and escalation that we weren't able to really manage on our own, and situations where either because of a failure to thrive or because of other components to the intervention, we weren't able to maintain a voluntary interaction, and we need to get this person connected to higher level of care. And at that point, we're needing to call in police because Cahoots' response is entirely voluntary. And as soon as we hit that involuntary point, we need to bring in those more traditional systems. That heavy presence in the community, being able to respond to so many calls for service, really allows us to save our community a lot of money. For every dollar spent on Cahoots, we estimate that at least $5 are going back into the community. The bulk of that is from diversions from the emergency room or by reducing dependence on ambulances as a means to get to the ER. But there's also a profound savings that comes in the form of our ability to, again, divert folks from the criminal legal system. I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but we've never had a staff member seriously injured as a result of, the work out in the field responding to these calls for service. And that's really predicated on aggressive training around situational awareness, scene safety, and verbal de-escalation and compassionate communication. We also take it a step further, though, and really make sure that our staff know how to drive defensively. And I think an important thing to really highlight about the Cahoots response, in addition to having a more compassionate harm reduction approach to all these situations, is the fact that we don't look like traditional systems. We don't look like police. We don't look like the fire department. We don't look like EMS. And that sends a message. When we show up on scene to talk to somebody, if they've never met Cahoots before, if they're brand new to town, that visual cue, right, that I'm wearing a t-shirt that has the Whiteboard Clinic logo on it instead of a uniform with a badge and a bunch of different equipment on my belt that might include a taser and a gun, handcuffs, that tells somebody in crisis, even if they've never met me before, that this is going to be a different kind of interaction, that we have an opportunity to really engage in a really, a much more therapeutic interaction. Our Cahoots teams are always going to be approaching our responses through the recognition that the individual that we're there to talk to, the person in crisis, is the expert in their lived experience. We have the obligation through least intervention necessary to maintain a safe and supportive space for that expert, right? That person with that lived experience, for us to really, explain what's been going on for them. And it's our obligation to really ask questions, listen, and empathize to really find a way to support and stabilize that person in the moment. We don't assume that we are going to be the be all end all for services. And so we are always looking to see what is it that we can get somebody connected to? Where is it that they can go to really find those supports that they need, so the next time that they're confronted with that trigger, that person, place, or thing that set them off, that the next time that need is going unmet, that they're able to find other supports rather than relying on that first response system to really get them to where they need to go. I think the last thing that I'll really highlight in this, because I know I've just kind of been rambling for a while and there's a lot of other stuff that I'm really excited to talk about with the other panelists here today, is that Cahoots is only as successful as we are because of our relationships with the community, because of our relationships with public safety, because of our relationships with other services in the community. There's this assumption in, even in my neighborhood here in Eugene, that just because Cahoots is showing up, that everything is fine for that person. It's raining, it's 35 Fahrenheit, it's windy, and they see the Cahoots van roll up, and that's just, okay, great, that person is going to be fine. That's a dangerous assumption that Cahoots is going to be able to connect that person to shelter, or that we're going to be able to get them equipped with what they need to be able to manage the elements on their own. Having a place to take somebody so that they can get, a warm meal, where they can get a shower, some dry clothes, the ability to get out of the elements for a while. Those are the things that really make a big difference for somebody. And so it's those connections, it's those relationships we have in the community that have really empowered us to go out there and support, stabilize, and de-escalate situations throughout the community. I know that there are a few questions that have come up already. I'm sure there's going to be more in the Q&A. But like I said, I'm really eager to see what we can do to really incorporate what Rick's working on, what Judy has going on, as well as what you all are trying to work on. And so I'll end my presentation there, and I look forward to the discussion that's going to be coming a little bit later on this evening.
Thank you, Tim. I have one question that I want to ask right away.
Sure.
Any job openings?
Yeah, we are always, accepting applications from folks who are really interested in supporting the work that we're doing down here in Eugene. And you mentioned The Simpsons. Matt Groening grew up in Springfield, so there are a lot of connections to that TV show. But we'll talk about Cahoots today, and I'm really excited to see what other questions come later on in our conversation.
Thank you. Me too. Judy, it's your turn.
Hi. Oh boy.
Hi.
I'm in the position of going after these two guys that it's kind of got my tummy in little fireflies here. But anyway,
Listen, I heard your stories. It'll be great. Let me know when you want me to start the PowerPoint and I'll come back, okay?
Yeah, okay. Hello everybody. First thing I want to say, yes, Nancy did a nice introduction of me, and I can't really see myself here. Okay. And the first thing I want to make very clear is that I'm not an expert. I have lived in Northwestern Ontario my whole life, and I've worked in this area, and I have so an educational background and lots of work experience, but I am by no means an expert on anything that I'm going to talk about. First thing I'd like to do is acknowledge that I'm in Thunder Bay, and that Thunder Bay is located on the traditional territory of Fort William First Nation. So I wanted to acknowledge that. Like Nancy said, I'm a member of the Albany Band, which is Fort Albany is located on the shores of the western shores of James Bay, but I grew up in Dryden, Ontario, which is a small northwestern Ontario town. I'm from a large mixed race family. My father is non-native, French and English mix, and my mother is a Cree. From, like I said, from James Bay area. I remember being about 4 or 5 years old, the first time I realized that I was not the same as my friends in my neighborhood, and being aware of being an Indigenous person, although that language wasn't used in those days. I remember running up the street. I was so excited because a new family of kids were moving into the neighborhood, and I had to go home for lunch. And if you remember, as a kid playing on the street, boy, taking time out to go for lunch was really bad. Anyway, I went running back, and that new girl was going to be there, and there she was. She was sitting on the steps of one of my friends' houses, and all the friends were gathered around her. She looked up and she saw me, and she just screamed and pointed, "There's an Indian!" And I remember looking around. I'd never heard that word before, so I didn't know what it meant. And then I realized that she was talking about me. And my friends were saying, no, that's just Judy. She's our friend. Come here. And so I remember that feeling of being different. And I knew that when she called me an Indian, she wasn't, giving me a compliment. So that was my first experience of understanding what race is. Of course, I went home and talked to my mom about it, and she explained to me that I am a Aboriginal kid, and that I should be proud of my heritage, and et cetera, et cetera. So I went on to have my own hardships and overcame lots of my hardships in my early 20s. And as a result, I started to work in addiction services, sharing my knowledge and experience of addictions and treatment. I trained as a social worker at the university, Lakehead University, and I spent most of my career in child welfare. I've also worked as an advocate at the advocate's office when it was open. That's where I met Nancy. And I've worked as a crisis worker in several northern fly-in communities. And like Nancy said, I'm currently a mental health counselor in Wapakika First Nation. And I'll share a little bit near the end of my presentation about Wapakika and my experience there. So I've done a little research here, and I've looked through journal articles, and I found one that was really interesting that had the voices of people who had been in residential school, and then what their understanding of their roles as parents as a result of that and prior to that. So before contact with the Europeans, First Nations communities in Canada and across Turtle Island were very thriving communities. They had their own traditional lifestyles, communities, practices for everything from justice to child welfare to political systems, who made decisions in communities, and women's voices were very often leaders in those communities' decision making. And so I found this little blurb. It's quite a long little blurb, so I hope you'll hang on with me. And it's quoted directly from the speaker, so you can tell she has a little accent, and I think it's very, very good. Anyway, I'm granny long ago, as far as I know, and our people had their way of raising their families. Like we had the grandparents, we had the aunts and uncles, and then we had the parents themselves. Our grandparents were there to teach us. They were our teachers. If we wanted to know something, we approached our grandparents and they taught us what they knew. And our aunts and uncles were the people that told us when we did something wrong. When we did something wrong, it wasn't our parents that scolded us or told us what we did was wrong. It was up to the aunts and uncles. They were the ones that disciplined their nephews, nieces, and I still see that sometimes today. Sometimes one of my sons, when his nephews do wrong, he tells them they did wrong. He doesn't wait for the parents to tell them. He tells them. That's the way it was long ago, and the parents were there just to love their kids. You give love to your kids, and your kids loved you in return. That way, when you didn't discipline them or give them heck for doing something wrong, there was never any resentment between the parents and the children. Like sometimes nowadays, maybe the parents tell their kids what they did was wrong, maybe, and then the child takes it the wrong way. They kind of figure my mother or dad doesn't love me. That's why they are treating me this way. That resentment grows. I think what our ancestors did, I think, was a good way, because there was no resentment between the parents and the children. So the children didn't have to be taken out of homes and when they were orphaned or the parents were sick, the rest of the family was there to just take them in and look after them. There was no such thing as who is going to take care of this child. Somebody just said, you can come home and live with me. I'll raise you and take care of you. And that was it. So I think behind all this was a love for the child. That's what it was. That way there was no resentment between the parents and the children. But that's how I heard. And I think that was a good way. So, you know, that really sets up a family life. And I remember one of my students sharing that, you know, whenever a baby was born into their community, and she was from a small northwestern Ontario fly-in community as well, that when the baby would come, probably from Sulikout after being born, because they don't have babies in the communities, everybody would gather in the house, and they would pass the baby around to all of the relatives, and the grandparents would be there, the aunties and uncles, the cousins. They'd pass the baby around in a circle, hugging and kissing the baby and welcoming them to their community and their life. So community life is something to be really, it's not a place that I grew up, but it sounds like a wonderful environment for any child. So what I really want to talk to you about today is the residential school, the impacts of residential school. And I'd like you to keep in mind two things as I talk about some of this stuff. The first thing is that this initiative, this policy of the Canadian government was focused very specifically on children. It and that it took place over several generations. So it wasn't just one time that one generation of people children were taken and went, got educated or whatever, and they come back, and it went on for generation after generation after generation. And it was very much zeroed in and focused on children. And I'm sure you've heard terms like to kill the Indian in the child. Purpose was to remove the child from the influence of their parents, their relatives, and their communities in an effort to civilize the children. Language, the language spoken in most of these schools, depending on where it was in Canada, was either English or French. First Nation languages use was strictly forbidden, and often children were punished for speaking their own language. Some children had to actually hold their tongue could be hours at a time, to remind them that they weren't to speak their own language. It was a separation of siblings. So the girls were in one ward, the boys were in the other ward. There was a no-touch policy between the children. So if you saw your brother, you weren't able to hug him or your sister, or you couldn't hold your friend's hand. One child talked about when her mother died, and how the nurse came, or the nun came and talked to her, told her her mother was dead, and never hugged her or acknowledged that as a painful event. They slept in large dormitories. The Christian churches were Anglican Church, United Church, Catholic Church, for the most part, were ran the schools at the behest of the Canadian government. So there was forced prayer. There was the teachings that their own ways of spiritual life, their own traditions, spiritual practices were evil or ways of the devil, and frightened them of their own ways. And then, of course, there was the abuse. When I said there was no touch policy, that didn't mean that the sexual, physical perpetrators of violence didn't touch the children. So I'll read a couple of little excerpts from this paper, from the mouths of survivors. In the dormitory, there were 3 rows of beds. There were 45 to 50 girls, and 2 nuns would sleep in the corner with the curtain drawn their beds, one at one end and one at the other. You'd go to sleep, and then they'd be walking around. It was like a jail, a penitentiary. That's what it was like when they took us from our parents and put us in there, like we did something wrong. Everybody was crying, little kids crying, because they didn't want to stay there. They'd get so lonesome. Another one, by going into the residential school, I missed knowing my mother. I missed learning how to talk Cree. I never really learned how to talk Cree. I was raised there, and they made us shut up every time we tried to talk Cree. I would have loved to spend more time with the grandfathers and grandmothers. We never went to visit them after our mother died. We never saw them after that. And I think as a result of this 100 and some years of this school practice, we raised a community of traumatized community of survivors. So then in moves Child Protection Services, of which I played my role. And I noticed one of the if there was any difference between when I started and when it's what it's like today. And I think there has been some changes. I started in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, and I finished one position in 2011, and I took on another position in another agency for a year or so after my so-called attempt at retiring. Anyway, I remember when I first started, and we would get a call, Mom was drinking, there was no food in the house, and kids were there. So we would go out and we would assess whether Mom was too drunk to care. If in fact there was no food, we would look in people's cupboards and fridges. And we would, if Mom was in fact too drunk to care, we would pick up the phone. Thunder Bay is a small town. I mean, it's 109,000 people or so. And then within that town with Indigenous people, you've got to be even smaller. Everybody knows everybody, for the most part. And oftentimes we knew aunties and uncles, sisters, brothers, grandmothers, and we would pick up the phone and say, so-and-so is drinking, the kids are here, can we bring you the kids? And then don't give them back until we talk to you tomorrow morning or something. And we could just do that based on what we knew about them. And I suppose in our own ways, we had done an assessment. But then the change came in, I think it was 09 or 08 or 09, that talked about kinship, and it recognized, I think, that the persons in charge of the legislation and creating changes to the child welfare system recognized that placing children with people that they were familiar with, people that perhaps loved them, was far better for the children than placing them with strangers in foster homes. But as government has always mentioned, yeah, and it was in response to an awful death of a child in Southern Ontario that was placed with relatives without background checks and whatnot, and the child wound up dead. But it impacted the way we practiced, because we then had to subject these same grandmothers, aunties and uncles, brothers and sisters to a new set of rules in order for us to meet the requirements as a Children's Aid Society. So, 1 week we could phone Granny and say, Granny, Johnny needs to stay at your house tonight. We'll come back tomorrow and talk to you about what we do from here with your daughter or your son or whatever. And the next day we had to say to Granny, well, in order for us to bring your child, you need to allow us to come into your house and make sure that you have a bed for Johnny. If Johnny has his own room, we have to make sure you have a railing on your stairs. You have to pass a criminal records check. You have to have a reference and all this. Like, it was beyond, and it was unreal. And so lots of times our families would say, never mind, I'm not going to do it. Or they would say, okay, and we'd come and do this intrusive assessment. And I could understand why, but it was a different way for us to practice than we had been practicing. And it caused more and more children to be brought into care. And a few years ago, it was always kind of known that Indigenous services, Indigenous child welfare programs were not funded in the same way that mainstream were. And so as a result, the First Nations Caring Society, under the leadership of Cindy Blackstock, and the like some Indigenous group, and I'm just having a brain fart here, took the government to court basically and used the Human Rights Code and whatnot, and it was determined that First Nations children on reserve, especially receiving child welfare services, were funded at a rate far below the provincial level for non-Indigenous children. And around the same time, there was the issue coming out of with respect to Jordan, a little boy by the name of Jordan in a Manitoba hospital that spent his life in hospital, while the province and the federal government argued about who should pay for his care on reserve. And he wound up living and dying in the hospital, having never spent any time in his family home or community. So as a result of that, there was an inquest, and so this issue of Jordan's principle was adopted, saying that any child in the province of Ontario, regardless of whether they're Indigenous or not, have a right to the same services and programs and services as any other child in Ontario. Which sounds really nice, but the government has been fighting that ever since. And when I listened to the prior to presentations, they're taking place in cities and towns that have existing services, and in many First Nations, there just isn't those kinds of services. They have medical, they have a clinic with nurses. They have access to doctors by phone. Rarely do doctors come into the community, but they do come. They'll spend 5 days or something and see a bunch of people. Dentists will come up to spend a couple of weeks and see pretty much everybody in the community. Speech and language therapists will come into the community every 4 or 5 months and see the kids that need to be seen. But there's a lot of there's a lot of gaps in those services. And I just want to talk just the use of police to implement the legislation with respect to residential school child protection services within these communities has left a deep, deep lack of trust of police in the communities dating back for generations. And oftentimes we'll be working in a situation and bring up the situation, the idea of maybe contacting police. And people just don't want to do that. They do not trust that the police are going to behave in a way that is thoughtful or kind. And I just want to talk about community life today. And this is just from my experience in Wapakika, because I've spent about 4 years there now, coming and going. And like I said, I travel in, I spend 10 days, usually, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. And I work pretty much, I'm on call pretty much 24/7 while I'm there. We do everything from crisis response to one-on-one to group counseling. We try and run programs in different services. We work with the community services, police, child welfare, the nursing staff. The band leadership is very active in ensuring that services to people is appropriate. So looking, just glancing at Wapakika, you would see poverty, you would see poor housing, you would see drug and alcohol abuse, people with impacts from long-standing impacts of drug and alcohol abuse, medical problems, mental health problems associated. I don't know if any of you have heard about Ralph Rowe. Ralph Rowe was an Anglican priest that worked up in Northern Ontario for many years. And it's estimated that he sexually abused around 500 young boys during his time up there. And many of those survivors are from Wapakika. He spent time in Wapakika. So we do have that underlying trauma of sexual abuse. Education system is, they have a school, goes up to grade 8. There's the only opportunities to get higher education is through distance ed through the WSEA program. Or the kids when they're 13, 14 go out of the community to school. There's a lot of child welfare involvement. Community suffers at a great level from grief and loss. There's suicides. The reason I started going to Wapakika in the first place was there was a rash of about 5 or 6 young girls died by suicide, and that rolled over to having suicidal ideations among many young people in the community. There's hopelessness there. Remember sitting talking to a bunch of kids one time and asking them what do they want to be when they grow up. They look at you like they don't really know what you mean by that. What do I want to be? And then, well, what kind of work would you like to do? I don't know. Never, not something they've ever really thought of. And then talk about them going to school, and so many of the kids say, well, I'm not going to school. I'm not going. Well, you could go to Sula Couch. You could go to Pelican Lake. You could go to Thunder Bay, and of course they just like, no, I'm too scared. I'm not going. And Thunder Bay, that's Murder Bay. A couple of them said. And how do you respond? And these are kids that are preteen, that have not ambition, no thoughts of a future outside of what's happening today, which in one sense is a good it's a good thing, live day to day. But and then there's a sense of learned helplessness. I remember responding. There was a sudden death of a woman's husband, and left behind some children and whatnot. And so we were called in and we went to visit. But there was about, I'd say at least 8 community members, women sitting there, went and cleaned her house, cooked supper. They were there and they were sitting on the couch. They would sometimes not saying anything, but they were there. And then they called me. They called me to go in. Well, I didn't know this woman from, I knew I'd see her, but I didn't know her. And so I think sometimes they abdicate their own power and want to turn it over to somebody else. But on the other part of that community life, I'm going overtime now. I'm starting to freak out.
Judy,
they've had, yeah.
It's fine. It's fine.
Okay.
Do you want me to start showing the PowerPoint now?
Just in 1 minute. So
Okay.
just the positive side of this community in the last few years that I've seen is that it's that they had their first powwow ever. And many people, it's a very Christian community, and many people in the community were really hesitant to attend and really had a lot of fear around their teachings of traditional ways and spiritual ways as being that of the devil or evil. They have the language. They have the Ojibwe language in their communities. Everybody speaks the language. Kids all speak English, and parents often speak English to their children, but they also speak the other language. So children often don't speak the language, but they know what it means. And when I'm assuming that when they get older, they'll be comfortable speaking it. There's hunting and fishing going on. There's the sharing. There's the winter, the spring hunts where animals are brought into the community center and people go there and help with the skinning and cutting and the sharing of meat and taking it to a different people from the community can come and get it, or they take it to elders for the most part. They have feasting in the community. They have lots of community events and lots of laughter. And you know what? I've laughed along and people have teased me because I don't speak the language or understand it, but they're laughing. You just know that whatever it is they're laughing at is funny. So I'll laugh along and then somebody say to me, what are you laughing at? But I don't know. I'm just laughing because they're laughing. So there's a lot of joy. I'm going to share some personal pictures with you just about my time while I tell you a story about an elder that shared this story of his dream to a community at a conference. And he talked about it, having this dream where he was standing in a big field. And he turned and he looked behind him. And behind them were lined up all these elders in their regalia, their beautiful regalia. And there was tons of them. And he turned from them and looked out over the field. And he said, all of a sudden there was this black, it looked like a cloud coming, but he couldn't really tell. But as it got closer, you realized they were children. They were flying, and they landed on the ground, and they were laughing and giggling and running, and babies were landing on the ground and rolling and laughing, baby after baby. And then he turned and looked again, and he said, that group of elders behind him was getting, there was fewer of them, and they seemed to be farther away. And then he turned and looked again across the field, and there the cloud came again, black, black sky, and there were hundreds of babies. There was tons and tons of babies laughing and landing on the ground, doing somersaults and rolling. And he turned again, and the elders got fewer and fewer, and further and further away. And as he turned again, more and more of these babies came from the sky, laughing and jumping and rolling upon each other, but hundreds and hundreds of them. He turned one last time, and there was only a couple of elders, and they were standing far, far in the distance. And as he turned again, he realized there was thousands of babies, thousands and thousands of children coming and landing on this earth, landing, running, giggling, smiling. And he challenged people that were listening that we were losing a time of our elders, of our traditional teachings, of our ways of being. And we were being faced with this multitude of children coming to us. And that it was up to us to prepare a soft landing place for them. And as I look at the faces of these children, I see hope. I see such love. And I see such wisdom. And it's my responsibility as a grandmother to ensure that we have a soft landing spot, that we create a space for these children to live. So I'll read this last bit. The strength of the culture is so powerful and is embedded in the very nature of our existences, that even if all systemic oppressions work and there was no ounce of culture left in us as a people, oops, can you go back? Culture, and the only thing noticeable as different would be the color of our skin. Our culture is so strong that one day someone would dream and we as a nation would start all over again. So thank you. And I just want to add one little thing of the final quote from the article that I was referring to. And that was this voice. Oh God, no, I can't find it. Oh, here it is. When asked what if there was any positives from the residential school, this person said, "We toughed it out, didn't we? They couldn't break us down." Thank you. That's it for me.
Thank you, Judy. Wow, that was powerful. So we have some questions that we shared with the panel ahead of time that I will ask a few. And I also see there is one question in the Q&A section so far, and we will get to that. I have a question actually for Tim, and it's about in the news recently, and we touched on it briefly when we met in our pre-panel briefing, Oregon's recent move to decriminalize street drugs, small possession amounts, and that you're the first state in the US to take this step, that the legislation has passed. And I guess I just wonder if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, we are here at Cahoots and Whiteboard Clinic are ecstatic about the passage of that measure. For so long, you know, communities across the world, but especially here in North America, have treated addiction as some sort of moral failing, and you know, have permitted oppressive practices under the auspices of the war on drugs to really, you know, perpetuate oppression, marginalization, and violence, especially for Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. So, you know, this turning point, this decriminalization of personal use amounts, I think is a really, you know, a positive step in the right direction. And to go along with that, this recognition that addiction is about health, you know, and this shift, you know, from enforcement to, you know, providing supportive resources and encouraging folks and providing opportunities to get connected to treatment if that's what they want, you know, I think is just incredibly powerful. We're excited to see what comes from it. I'm excited to see reduced policing and in various, you know, areas that intersect with the work that we do here on Cahoots. And we are also just really excited to see what kind of new resources, what new kind of opportunities are made available to our community as a result of this passage.
I have a question for Judy, based on something you said in the presentation tonight when you talked about referring to Rick and Tim's presentations and talking about the services that are available and the possibilities because of that. I guess my question would be to you, what you see as possible solutions to, I mean, it's mammoth, and you can go all the way to the absolute basic necessities of life like water, and so many Indigenous communities not even having drinking water, not even having water at all, to a range of services, mental health counseling, like you were talking about, dentists come in for 2 weeks, and school, the fact that young people living in these communities have to fly to Thunder Bay or Pelican Lake for school, and they're scared, and of course they're scared, and calling Thunder Bay murder city because of the 7 deaths, the 7 feathers. Absolutely. So what do you see, if any, that some solutions might be to mitigate that, to address that?
I think it's all in the community. Like I mentioned that time when I got called to go because a woman was crying because her husband had just died. She had everything she needed before I got to the door. So helping people to understand that they have that strength, they have the capacity. So, you know, and they do, you know, Wapakika has come a long way and is situated itself in a very positive way for social services. You know, there are community members that are trained in mental health first aid. And so they're very often the first people called, you know, in a crisis. And so they're their family and their friends and their neighbors that come to their homes first before they bring in the so-called professionals.
So what I'm hearing you say, I think, is that the solution perhaps lies, at least part of it or half of it, lies with having the community has the strengths, the community has the people, they have the population, and
I mean,
to
they
build.
used to call it building capacity.
Yes,
But,
yes.
you know, I don't really like that term because it assumes that there is no capacity there, so we have to build. So it's to build on strengths, and to really encourage people to understand their own strengths and their own powers. Yeah. And that takes time. I mean, I've been 4 years in the community, and I'm just starting to make some meaningful connections. You know, it takes time. And as with, you know, I was in the community first on a trauma team. So when Mr. Ford was voted in Ontario, that funding for those trauma teams was cut.
Yeah,
I remember that.
From like $2 million to $200,000 or something. So those, and we recognize that much of the problems are because of trauma, and trauma is a deep-rooted systemic issue. And you can't, and you know, the way the government deals with it, and they'll get on the air and they'll say, oh, we sent 700,000 or we sent $2 million or we, you know, we spent this much money, and it's always about dollars and cents. And
Yeah.
and they've still got problems.
Yeah.
But you know what? Every time you turn around, it's a different group of people going into the same community. And like I said, it takes 4 years to get your foot in the door a little bit.
Yeah. Thank you. So for Rick, actually, I have a question, and then we'll go to the Q&A. There are 2 questions now I see in the Q&A section. But Rick, you talked a little bit about economic justice in your presentation, and I have a question about individual steps that people could take in order to move towards economic justice. Do you have any ideas on that or comments about that?
Well, I think there's different, so if you talk about individually what can be done, I mean, there's the whole model of, you know, community economic development and social enterprise and social innovation. So I know many people who are taking their great ideas and turning them into products that can be either sold or done in a barter, you know, sort of barter way. So you're not always, you know, exchanging money in that. So, and I don't know if that gives economic justice per se. It typically alleviates some of the stress of economic deprivation. So that I think that, you know, it's also a larger question that relates to, you know, poverty, living wage, universal basic income, those sorts of things, because I think our economic existence is nested in, you know, sort of the neoliberal sort of capitalist structure. So there are some things that people can do, but I think it's, you know, much bigger than that at the same time. But again, another example though, you know, with the next generation builders is creating sort of pathways for young persons into the trades. So I think having, you know, viable jobs and careers, which oftentimes are not profiled, you know, in schools. We move towards the sort of elitist model, get a university education, whereas trades are incredibly both lucrative, but also rewarding and quite healthy too, because they're physical as well as engaging the mind. So those are a couple things.
I have another question, if you don't mind.
Nope.
I'm just thinking about the model that you talked about, and I did remember seeing that in the news about Metrolinx and the Jane Finch community and that partnership, and when they pulled out, and then I guess public pressure. That model, though, of taking a huge project like that with dollars attached, millions of dollars, billions of dollars. What do you think of that model? Also, in other sectors,
I think it's a way of having a stakehold in large ventures. So this has been extended to Woodbine Casino, to the Finch LRT, and the building of a hospital. In Seattle, and throughout the States, but in Seattle, they have a large community benefit project underway that has to do with the social housing there. So they're engaged in renovating, retrofitting, but utilizing, once again, the strengths of the community, hiring local people, training some people up. There's a range of jobs within construction, from office related to laborer to skilled labor. So I think that model actually is great, because it puts, you know, some brakes on, you know, unfettered public spending. And a lot of times it goes to larger contractors and that, and communities don't see the benefit. Just a simple thing is they have to purchase all sorts of goods. Well, if those are purchased in the community, then the money goes back into the community. So that's where you get, you know, a model of an ecosystem, which I think is really important.
All right, thank you. I'm going to go to the Q&A. I see that that Joy, you have texted, I think I only saw part of it, that your question was answered by Judy initially when we first started speaking to the panel. Is that, Kira, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. So Bryden Gombe is asking for Tim. Here, so much is caused by homelessness. When you help your clients, have you a way of helping them find safe housing?
Oh, I wish. We have, according to some recent reports, our area has the highest rate of homelessness per capita in the United States. And I, can't count the number of times as a first responder that I've gone out to talk to, one of my neighbors, one of my, members of my community who is experiencing shelter insecurity, and we are left to really work with what we have to keep them warm and dry where they are for the night. We on Cahoots have tried to really find creative ways to address the lack of shelter in our community. There is one larger shelter that was a congregate setting that was privately funded, privately operated, and required that you were comfortable sitting through a faith-based ceremony and could pass, a clean, urinalysis before you could have a place to stay for the night. And so that was really limiting to folks who were sober and identified as Judeo-Christian. In order to really work with what there is out in our community, we've had to partner with other housing groups, community supported shelters where I volunteer. It facilitates camps that are sanctioned, that are set up in our community, where there'll be 10, 15 huts that are assembled with support in the form of case management, but allow these camps to really be self-governed. We see a lot of success in those camps. And so Cahoots has built huts that are in these camps where we can lodge somebody for a few days while they, wait to get that next paycheck so that they can finally, pay first, last, and deposit on an apartment, or, with another housing group in our community for longer term stays where maybe somebody needs a couple of months so that they can get through a wait list. There are times where we have access to refer folks to a couple of studio apartments, and we see the funding from police department to support those housing in those units, but those are inadequate. We're talking about Cahoots respite placements. That's four places, for us to refer folks to. And so we find ourselves more often, rather than connecting, folks to shelter, being advocates for shelter. And so, Cahoots takes a very strong stance in support of, housing first, and permanent supportive housing for folks in our community. And we really recognize that the majority of crises that we're experiencing in our community are really related to a lack of resources to meet needs. And that when we see these crises, it's a response to that unmet need. And so we're trying to really get out there and really confront this issue, confront the fact that camps are still being swept, despite the police department and the city saying that they aren't going to do that, despite guidance from the CDC saying that during the COVID pandemic, you should not be sweeping camps. I live in an area that has a higher rate of homelessness than other parts of the area community. And it's a weekly thing to see the violence of a camp sweep occurring in our community. So there's a lot to do, and we're trying, but we're not there yet.
Thank you, Tim. Another question from Yaz, actually, who's also a member of our advisory group. This is for Judy. And Yaz says, Judy, I love what you said about community. How do you feel about separate CAS agencies for Black and Brown communities, since Black children are disproportionately involved in Metro CAS, separate CAS, maybe you think, a separate CAS with the community might lower these rates? That's the question.
I think the closer you get to people, that the better off you're gonna do. And so, yeah, you need to organize your grassroots and people that are committed to ensuring that children have their needs met. Go for it. I mean, there's Jewish children's aid, there's Catholic children's aid in Toronto, like there's all kinds.
Yeah.
And I mean, here we have an Indigenous agency, but a lot of our kids are living in non-Indigenous homes.
Yeah.
They're very far removed from their people and their culture. And it's having harsh impact. So I say, yeah, start at the grassroots And I think, you know, with the agency I worked with, that's where it started. It started with a few people
Mhm.
that had kids in mainstream care, and leaders that didn't like what they were seeing, that gathered together and created a system.
Yeah, and look at it now, right? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing is, you have to follow that damn legislation, and oftentimes that legislation is so hard to interpret.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or it's I shouldn't say it's hard to interpret it. It's interpreted only in one way of doing things. I
Depending
mean, the
on, yeah.
good news of the Ontario legislation is that there is a Part 10 to the legislation that speaks to Indian and Native children.
Right.
But I don't think it's being used as much as it could be by individual First Nations.
And I think we have to accept the fact as we look at it, all the various control systems, child welfare, policing, educated, really are using a Eurocentric colonial settler lens. So they're not going to be able to respond to who's in front of them, particularly when we look at the diversity within our communities and that. So there's a huge disjunction. And I know the challenge that, you know, some people are trying to do is try to work within those systems to change them. So that to me becomes, you know, a big question mark, because it's like working in the criminal justice system to make it less criminal justice like. There's a bit of a, you know, contradiction in that, because there are limits to what you're able to do and how much you can, you know, tweak something that can, you know, often be untweakable.
Yeah,
You know,
I was never one to follow the rules, and my motto was always it's easier to ask forgiveness than permission.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I made individual decisions based on the needs of individual children, and then said, "Oh, I didn't know that."
That's social innovation.
yeah,
That's how I
Well,
would
I was called a troublemaker.
Yeah, you got to, you know, reframe it. I'm just innovating.
Yeah.
There's another question from Lilia or Lilia. It's for Tim. Tim, the Cahoots program is really inspirational. Has Cahoots put together some sort of educational tool to help folks in other cities form a similar program?
That's actually what I spend all my days doing, is talking with other communities about how to, you know, implement services based on the Cahoots model. You know, really salient to what was just discussed. It's also really important to recognize that this isn't a cookie cutter program, right? We, you know, listening to the voices of the community that we intend to serve here in Eugene and Springfield was vital to developing our program. And as we go talk to other communities, whether that's, you know, whether that's New York City, Portland, Oregon, it's really about listening to your community as you build this program. And so we can help folks with best practices. We can train on how we approach de-escalation or harm reduction, what strengths-based approaches mean to us, right? But at some point, it doesn't matter what I tell you, because I don't, you know, I'm not living and breathing, you know, in your community, right? You know, we need to bring these voices in. And so, you know, I think that the biggest rubric, you know, the biggest template that we can offer is really just go out and listen. You know, spend time hearing from, you know, those communities that are being oppressed and marginalized, that are being killed by, you know, the current contemporary approaches to enforcement in communities. You know, really listen. Just that's it. Just listen. That's the single most successful component of this kind of service, is that recognition that that the folks that we're serving are the experts, you know, and we need to carry that expertise with us as we move forward.
I have a question, and I don't want you to violate confidentiality, but are any of the agencies or entities that you're talking to, are any of them situated in Canada?
The Victoria City Council did approve, you know, funding to move forward and pursuing a pilot. Where that's at, I haven't heard, but other than that, we have had a few different conversations with CAMH in Toronto as well, to really kind of discuss how this might fit into other services that the hospital is offering. But those are, those have been kind of conceptual conversations. It's been a while. Everything in Victoria really, kind of seemed like was starting to pick up steam this summer, and then there's a lot going on. We recognize that what we're talking about is a big systems change in a lot of ways, and that's a hard concept to really wrap your mind around. There are a lot of moving pieces and a lot of stakeholders that really need to be at the table while they're talking about this. And so I'm excited to branch out, and I hope more cities in Canada really take the time to really consider this. There's so much potential, and so
Yeah, I hope so.
We'll see. Yeah.
Jeff is asking a question, Jeff Everden. It's again with cahoots. And then there's another one for Rick coming after that, I see. I'm hoping, I know it's 5 to 9, but I'm hoping we could stay on a little bit, because it looks like this is going well, and a few more questions. I would hate to cut people off at this point. So there's a question from Jeff. I'm wondering if there's any kind of documentation for the origin of cahoots that I might reference. And part 2, how have this, okay. So part 1 is that there is documentation. I do know that, if you want to talk about that, Tim, and it's on your website, I think.
Yeah, we have a pretty thorough kind of cross-section of all the different media that's come out about this recently, but there are also a couple of links to publications or references to a couple of books that include information on really how Whiteboard Clinic as an organization was founded, what our approaches are, and how we fit into the larger context of what was really a profound grassroots movement here in Eugene, Oregon in the late 60s.
And then part 2 of the question is, how have the staff fared? Has the process of working with the project been helpful for them, or has there been much burnout and turnover?
Well, I've been working for the program for 10 years, and by no means am I the senior most employee. There's something special. There's some magic about this program, about doing this work, and about working where we do. And so we generally see that if folks make it through our training process, which takes about 6 months, if you get through that first 6 months, then you're going to be with us for 6+ years. We don't hold people to it if they leave earlier. We do see that a lot of folks, we're a stop on the way to med school, or going on to get their PhD or something, and we love that, because that means that we get to share that message, and that we know that those folks are going to be taking those lessons out into the community with them wherever they go. There's a real strong sense of family, real strong sense of community, and that a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're organized as a collective. It doesn't matter if it's your first day or your 1000th. You've got something valuable to add to our conversations and our decision-making process, and I would really argue that is what has really kept many of us, so engaged and so enthusiastic about this work for so long.
So another question from Yaz, and this one is for Rick.
Mm-hmm.
Rick, Black people, in particular Black men, are 20 times more likely to be shot by police in Toronto. What can we do to protect our youth and lower that stat as a community?
I can only answer that as an alongsider. That's not my lived experience, but from working with communities such as that, and from my vantage point when I was at the college, whenever there was a tragedy like that, someone or a number of students would know that person, or know of that person, or live in their community. So it's something that has this huge rippling traumatic effect. The simple answer is we need to start young. We need to build strong communities. We need to have schools that are inviting and welcoming. I ran a School as a Hub project for 10 years. And one of the things we aimed to do was to have representation in the classroom from the community, or people who represented the community. One of the huge issues in schools is that typically the teaching staff are in the majority white. So if you're a young Black person, where do you see your identity in that system? Look at the curriculum. Recent analysis of the curriculum around Black history shows that there's almost nothing written about the true history of Black persons. Similarly for Indigenous persons. But I think it needs to focus in on supporting families, supporting pride, supporting their identity, cultural practices, and aiming towards a future where there are opportunities, where they will be, navigated through towards excellence. The Peel School Board is just undertaking that right now as they deconstruct their system, because Black persons are underrepresented in the university program stream. So clearly there's striking bias in that. So we need to look at it all levels, because as it is now, it's door after door after door is shut. So we need to start to break those open. But I always say start young. An infant is not born to be shot, but then later in life, the circumstances have led that person to be in a vulnerable state. We have to look at how we're creating those vulnerabilities, rather than, and more importantly, how do we create opportunity?
Thank you. A question from Chris Hitchcock, and I think this is our last one for the evening. Is there a way for small communities with trauma history to share their strengths and learnings amongst one another? Some kind of a conference that recognizes lived experience. That's for everybody, I think.
Well, I can answer about Wapakiko, because Wapakiko over the last several years has been hosting a conference, and it's a Survivors of Suicide conference. I'm sorry. And they have people from all over coming to that conference.
You need some water.
And they have different workshops happening, and it's quite the conference. There's lots of people. I mean, the problem, if there's a problem, is that lots of people that come. There's only one hotel, one hotel in the community, and there's six rooms available in that hotel. So a lot of people come, stay with community members. So it's oftentimes it's families or friends that stay in each other's houses or something. But it's quite a good conference of all topics, from trauma to grief and loss to suicide prevention to, there's lots of really good topics. It's a great conference. And they have it every year. I don't know about this year.
Your virtual.
Because it's usually in the wintertime.
I mean, I would say, Chris, to you that it's something perhaps that the Only Way Forward project could talk about in our follow-up meeting, your idea with the advisory board present, and that means Judy would be present with her wisdom and to share what she would think of something like that. And maybe that's something you want to share with us in December or January when we do follow-up work. I think on that note, now I see, I'm not supposed to look at the chat, Kira, I know. I see that Chris has written something. And since we're at the end, I'm going to break the rule and I'm going to look down to the bottom. He's written, I think, of the Nunavut communities. Yeah. So I think we've come to the end. I really can't thank the speakers, the panel members enough. I have certainly deepened my understanding and now I have more questions and more ideas than ever. Thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your knowledge and your lived experience with us. It was quite wonderful. It was really quite terrific. Our next panel is next week, and it's the ways forward and next steps. It's next Thursday at 7 o'clock. Kira will send the link. Kira, I know you have a couple of things you have to say.
Yeah, super quick. First of all, thank you so much to our panelists. I can't tell you how grateful we are to have you here with us. And there's tons of notes coming in on the chat there saying thank you and how much people enjoyed. So thanks again. And I also just want to mention, last week I posted a survey and we got some really useful feedback information. So I'm gonna post a link to another survey, many of the same questions, but we'd really like to hear, especially in the bottom few questions, some of your feedback on the panels and how things ran and what information you'd like to know more about. So I'm gonna post that again. It's a different survey, so if you've already done it, please feel free to do it again. Also, I just want to remind people that this event was put on by Canadian Friends Service Committee, which is a registered charity, and we survive mainly by individual donations. So if you'd like to know more about us or how to donate, I'm going to post a link to that as well, if you'd like to have a look. But thank you to all those that attended as well. We're so glad that you're here.
Yes, thank you everyone for sharing your time with us and for your openness to coming and listening to different ideas and new ways and alternatives to look at the repressive, oppressive, punitive system that we have in place right now. Thank you so much.